So we are going to review just a little tiny bit before we move on and discuss about the tabernacle. I want to go back and just quickly go over again, back on D in the outline, the purpose of the law. I think it's important, and I think it's especially important to understand that we derive from the Old Testament and the elements in the Old Testament that we're studying our New Testament theology. That is unfortunately not a well understood concept in most evangelical or conservative churches today. People seem to believe that the New Testament came from the New Testament authors and had apparently nothing to do with the Old Testament, though they should realize that they were all Jews who all knew the Old Testament and, of course, were very versed in what the Holy Spirit showed them. So, the first point is that the law gave Israel a separate identity and separation from customs of pagan peoples. They were meant to be separate because they had a separate destiny, just like in the Abrahamic Covenant, they had a separate nation, they had a separate land, they had a separate blessing. They were all separate things. And to accomplish what God wanted, and to the pinnacle of that accomplishment, which of course was the birth, ministry, death, and resurrection of the Messiah, they had to be separate in many ways. Secondly, it provided Israel, of course, with a civil government structure. You can imagine a couple million people coming out of Egypt. They had to have some structure. Otherwise, it would have been a mob who would have had no idea what they were doing. They ended up being highly organized, grouped. They even marched in a certain way. They camped in a certain way. And they were given unique customs. Those customs were not necessarily completely understood by them. But each one of those customs ended up with its fulfillment in the future. And of course, that's part of what we're promised in Hebrews. Paul, or the author, I think Paul, but the author of Hebrews tells us that they did these things not necessarily knowing what they were going to be, because their ultimate fulfillment was actually for us in the church. Thirdly, God gave the people a perfect ethics system, which is the reflection of God's own character. And it's important to understand it's an absolute system, just as God's character is absolute. I put in here, contrary to the concept of our modern society, God does not grade on the curve. All right? There is no, well, okay, your 86% will give you an A anyway. Not in God's economy, because all of this is based on His character. So when we look at the ethics that the Bible teaches us, they aren't derived from nowhere. They aren't picked from somewhere. They don't come from other cultures. They are derived literally from the character of God Himself. We see, and you don't have to turn here, but I mentioned here James 2:10. Okay, it says that if you follow the whole law, but have fallen at one point, then you have become guilty of all. That's the absolute nature of God's standard. And of course, that standard is impossible for human beings. But God provides a way. Number 5, that it is the law is a perfect standard compared with our imperfect ability, and therefore creates in us need. The whole point of the first 3 chapters of the book of Romans, which its crescendo is in Romans 3:20. Therefore, Paul says, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. That's the place where God wants each human being that will listen to Him. He wants them to recognize their own sin and be honest about their own failures and recognize that through their own efforts they can never be good enough, no matter how much they try. And that drives them to need. And that need, of course, is fulfilled in the grace of God through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So the law, in its perfect standard, causes a condemnation. It condemns sin to show its effects spiritually. And in condemning sin and in pointing out the nature of sin and demonstrating in each person their own sinfulness, it of course leads to the inevitable conclusion that's the result of law: death. It leads only to death. But of course, through the death of the law becomes the life in Christ through his forgiveness. But its ultimate point is spiritual death, and we need to be able to realize that. The law also is a diagnosis. It diagnoses man's problems. It diagnoses man's sinfulness. It diagnoses mankind's rebellion. It is, quote, the spiritual x-ray machine. And we see, of course, many aspects of this being pointed out in the book of Hebrews. If you want to turn to Hebrews 10 and look a couple of these verses, Hebrews chapter 10, we're going to be in Hebrews a lot tonight because the author of Hebrews brings us in the New Testament, in his very Jewish book of Hebrews, back into the book of Exodus, where we see the roots of all these things, where the themes come from. In chapter 10, look at, for instance, starting in verse 4, "For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take sins away." And then drop down to 10 and 11 and 12. "By this will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. And every priest stands daily ministering and offering time after time the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins." This is what the Jews did not understand. Even though they understood that there was an atonement for sin, they did not adequately understand that it was never complete. It only atoned for the sins of the previous year. Therefore, it was always an incomplete atonement. Then you had the sins that started right away for the next year. And of course, they had no future in that sense. But in verse 12, "But he, having offered one sacrifice for all sins for all time, sat down at the right hand of God." And this is, of course, the importance of these things. But they all come from the model back here in Exodus. So we're going to look at that model tonight. So let's begin to look at the tabernacle. We showed this little video about the elements. Well, not all the elements. Like I said, it didn't show the Ark of the Covenant, interesting enough. But let's go to the tabernacle. Now, first of all, God set up an elaborate pictorial illustration system which taught elements and principles of what he must do to reconcile sinful humanity to himself. That was the purpose of the tabernacle. It was, everything about it is illustrated. And we're going to look at some of these components tonight. But even looking at some of the components, I'm going to tell you that we're touching the surface of the components. Every one of these components we could spend a week on each one of them easily and talk about how elegantly, down to the numbers and the sizes and the dimensions, how they fit prophetic elements for the future in terms of what Christ would do. But that would take us an immense amount of time, and we don't have that amount of time in trying to cover all these panels. So, at any rate, at least we'll look at some of them. Now, the tabernacle, which is also called the tent of testimony, it's in its structure, in its furnishing, and in its rituals, demonstrated God's redemptive plan. The kind of summary point of this is the 9th chapter of Hebrews. And we might even read that through tonight. Why don't we do that? Why don't we read it through so that you have this general idea? Let's go back and I'll read Hebrews chapter 9, verses 1 through 28. Now, even the first covenant had regulations of divine worship in the earthly sanctuary. So there was a tabernacle prepared, the outer one, in which the lampstand and the table and the sacred bread, this is called, of course, the holy place. Remember, there's this 100 foot approximately or so by 50 foot rectangular structure, right? It has an 8.5 foot linen curtain around it. It has one opening, which we'll get to in a minute. Inside it, there are elements. Of course, we saw a few of them in this video illustration. But there's an inner tent, and it has two components to it. The first of the components was called the holy place, and it had certain elements inside it, which we will talk about here in a minute. And then inside that was the inner sanctum, called, of course, the Holy of Holies, and it had certain elements inside of it, which again we'll talk about here in a second. So, and behind the second veil, there was a tabernacle, which is called the Holy of Holies. So there's two veils. We're going to look at that. Having a golden altar of incense and the Ark of the Covenant covered on all sides with gold, in which was a golden jar containing manna, and Aaron's rod which budded, and the tables of the covenant, which means the Ten Commandments. That's what he means by the tables of the covenant. And above it were the cherubim of the glory overshadowing this mercy seat, but of these things we cannot speak now in detail. Now, verse 6. Now, when these things have been thus prepared, the priests are continually entering the outer tabernacle, performing the divine worship. But into the second, that is the inner, the high priest enters once a year. That is called Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur. All right. It says once a year, not without taking blood, which he offers for himself and then for the sins of the people committed in ignorance. Verse 8, the Holy Spirit is signifying this. The way into the holy place has not yet been disclosed, which the outer tabernacle is still, while the outer tabernacle is still standing, which is a symbol for the present time. Accordingly, both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make the worship perfect in conscience, since they relate only to food and drink and various washings and regulations for the body imposed until a time of reformation. In other words, it's limited in its scope. It's only for that year. Verse 11, but when Christ appeared as high priest of the good things to come, that is, his completion of these things, he enters through the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this creation, and not through the blood of goats and of calves, but through his own blood. He entered the holy place once and for all, having obtained eternal redemption. That is, he is the ultimate high priest, the final high priest. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of the heifer sprinkling those who have been defiled sanctify for the cleansing of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, the Messiah, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. Verse 15. And for this reason, he is the mediator of the new covenant. We call it the covenant of grace. In order that since a death has taken place for the redemption of the transgressions that were committed under the first covenant, those who have been called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. Verse 16. For where a covenant is, there must of necessity be the death of the one who made it. For a covenant is valid only when men are dead, for it is never enforced while the one who made it lives. In other words, his point is, in every case, a death must occur. Go back to Abraham's covenant. What did God do? As we went through Abraham's covenant. God did a very interesting demonstration with Abraham as he ratified the covenant he made to Abraham. He took these sacrificed animals, he cut them in half, he put Abraham to sleep. Okay? And then he, in the form of a burning furnace with smoke and fire, in that presence, he walked in between the pieces. Okay? A death of the animals had to occur. It's only ratified by a death. Okay? He signified the death of these animals in that Abrahamic covenant. In this covenant, of course, it's the covenant of the Son of God himself, the Messiah, who ratifies this. Verse 18, therefore, even the first covenant was not inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment had been spoken by Moses to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of the calves and of the goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people. This was the ratification of the Mosaic Covenant. And in the same way, he sprinkled both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry with the blood. And according to the law, one may almost say, all things are cleansed with blood, and without shedding of blood there is no forgiveness. Verse 23. Notice the importance of verse 23. Therefore it was necessary for the copies of the things in the heavens to be cleansed with these, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. The tabernacle and all the elements and all the ritual is an earthly representation of the spiritual tabernacle in heaven. Verse 24, for Christ did not enter a holy place made with hands, a mere copy of the true one, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Nor was it that he should offer himself often, as the high priest enters the holy place year by year with blood not of his own. Otherwise, he would have needed to suffer often since the foundation of the world. But now, once at the consummation of the ages, he has been manifested to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Verse 27, and as much as it is appointed for men to die, and after that, this comes judgment. So Christ also, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, shall appear a second time for salvation without reference to sin to those who eagerly await him. In other words, when he comes back, it isn't going to be about sin. It's going to be about reigning on the earth. Now, it's an excellent summation by the author about the Old Testament sections here. So let's look more closely at the tabernacle. Go to your outline of the tabernacle. As I said, I started out with this quote from Hebrews 8:5 about it, who serve as a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. We start out, and go to Exodus now, because you're going to look at some verses in the book of Exodus. We're going to see a bunch of different verses we're going to read, and we'll go first to Exodus 27. I want you to notice how everything that we're going to read is typological, and it's all fulfilled in the death and resurrection of Christ. So it's an illustration. So in Exodus 27, starting in verse 9, we have the story of this account of the outer court. Remember what we looked at here. There's a tent. It's rectangular. Okay? It's 8.5 feet high. You can't see over it. You can't see under it. And there's only one door to it. So one begins outside and symbolically excluded from the life and presence of God. That's the beginning of every person. That's how the Jews had to also experience this. As I said, the white linen fence was 8.5 feet tall. Notice that in this fence, there was only one door. What do we read in John 10:9? Jesus says, I am the door of life. No one comes and enters but through me. Okay? One door. Now, let me just read this to you briefly. And starting verse 9, a few verses, so you just briefly get an idea of the elements of the outer court. And you shall make the court of the tabernacle. On the south side there should be hangings for the court of fine twisted linen, 100 cubits long for one side. Okay? That would be about 150 feet, 100 cubits, close to. And its pillars shall be 20, with their 20 sockets of bronze, the hooks of the pillars, and their bands shall be of silver. Let me assure you, though we're not going to go into it tonight, all those things have symbolic and typological meaning too. And its pillars shall be 20, and as I said, I'm sorry, read 10, 11. And likewise, for the north side, in length there shall be hangings 100 cubits long, and its 20 pillars, with their 20 sockets of bronze, the hooks of the pillars, and their bands shall be of silver. And for the width of the court of the west side shall be hangings of 50 cubits. So it's about 75 feet. With their 10 pillars and their 10 sockets, and the width of the court on the east side shall be 50 cubits. And the hangings for the one on the side of the gate shall be 15 cubits, with their 3 pillars and their 3 sockets. And for the other side shall be the hangings of 15 cubits, with their 3 pillars and the 3 sockets. And for the gate of the court there shall be a screen 20 cubits of blue and purple and scarlet material and fine twisted linen, the work of the weaver, with the 4 pillars and their sockets. All the pillars around the court shall be furnished with silver bands and with their hooks and silver and with their sockets of bronze. And the length of the court shall be 100 cubits, and the width 50 throughout, and the height 5 cubits, of fine twisted linen, and their sockets of bronze. All the utensils of the tabernacle used in all of its service, and all of its pegs, and all the pegs of the court shall be of bronze. Now, again, I wish we had time to go into all the elements for me to show you how they all have their application in Christ also. But notice, if you would, keep your hand in Exodus, but go, if you would, to the book of Ephesians. I want to read in chapter 2, verses 13 through 22. Ephesians 2. Notice what Paul says here. I think what he says is going to make a little bit more sense to you when you understand the tabernacle. Starting verse 13, but now in Christ, you who formerly were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who made both groups into one and broke down the barrier of the dividing wall. What's the dividing wall he's talking about?
Into the Holy of Holies.
Well, ultimately into the Holy of Holies. But notice he's saying Christ created an access or a doorway for the presence of God. We're seeing the illustration, the physical illustration of it in the structure of the tabernacle. See, verse 15, by abolishing in his flesh the enmity, which is the law of the commandments contained in the ordinances, that in himself he might make the two into one new man, thus establishing peace, and might reconcile them both in one body to God through the cross, by having put to death the enmity. And he came and preached peace to you who were far away, and peace to those who were near. For through him we both have our access in one spirit to the Father. What's the whole point of the outside court? It's the issue of having access into the inside. Verse 19, so then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and are of God's household, having been built upon the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, Jesus himself being the cornerstone, in whom, notice the next verses, in whom the whole building being fit together, is growing into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are being built together in a dwelling of God in the Spirit. Tell me the New Testament isn't Jewish. It's Jewish from stem to stern, from Matthew to Revelation. It's all finding its fulfillment in these things that start back in the book of Exodus. Let's move on to the brazen altar. Go back with your hand in Exodus. We're going to go back to Exodus. We're going to read verses 1 through 8. The bronze altar, the brazen altar. Starting in verse 1. And you shall make the altar of acacia wood, 5 cubits long and 5 cubits wide. The altar shall be square, and its height shall be 3 cubits. And you shall make it horns on its 4 corners. The horn shall be of one piece with it, and you shall overlay it with bronze. So the horns built in each corner. And you shall make its pails for removing ashes, and its shovels and its basins, and its forks and its fire pans, and you shall make all its utensils of bronze. And you shall make it for a grating of network of bronze, and on the net you shall make 4 bronze rings at its 4 corners. And you shall put it beneath, under the ledge of the altar, that the net may reach halfway up the altar. And you shall make poles for the altar, poles of acacia wood, and overlay them with bronze. And its poles shall be inserted into the rings, so that the pole shall be on the 2 sides of the altar when it is carried. You shall make it hollow with planks. It was shown to you in the mountain, so they shall make it. Literally, God shows Moses an absolute, probably holographic diagram of all of this stuff. Okay? He saw it.
Had to happen to them.
He did. He saw it.
Can you imagine when you come back down the mountain and he's talking to his engineers,
Yeah.
he's going through those instructions?
Right.
You do what? Where? When?
And he goes, didn't you see it? This is the way God showed it to you, you know? So, we have here an altar which is about 7.5 square feet, covered in brass, with a horn in each corner. Why a horn? Because as the animal would be brought for the sacrifice, it would be tied to the horn in the corner. Of course, this is a sacrifice that would be eventually a burnt sacrifice. The blood would be, the animal would be killed, the blood would be gotten from the animal, but the animal was also burnt on it. Therefore, there were ashes and this is why it had utensils that we're talking about. Okay. So the priest would sacrifice the animal. The animal had to be spotless, and it was a substitute killed to cover the sins of the people. We see here, we actually read this because we read Hebrews 9, but you'll be reminded of the verses 11 through 14 of Hebrews 9. So, we then have this next element called the laver. Turn to Exodus, over a couple chapters, Exodus 30. And let's read about the laver. It is a brazen basin that held water. We're going to look here at verses 17 through 21 of Exodus 30. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, You shall also make a laver of bronze, with its base of bronze, for washing. And you shall put it in between the tent of the meeting and the altar, and you shall put water in it. And Aaron and his sons shall wash their hands and their feet from it. When they enter the tent of meeting, they shall wash with water, that they may not die, or when they approach the altar to minister, by offering up in smoke a fire, a sacrifice to the Lord. Verse 21, So they shall wash their hands and their feet, and that they may not die, and it shall be a perpetual statute for them, for Aaron and his descendants throughout his generations. What is it that Jesus did to begin his ministry on this earth? What did he do? No, that's not what he was baptized by John. What was John's ministry? It was the ministry of repentance, preparation. So Jesus comes to John, this prophet, I will claim, of the Old Testament. I'm going to say that John was an Old Testament prophet. Gary, what do you think?
Definitely was.
He was not really technically a New Testament prophet because he didn't talk about, he knew who Messiah was and he was preparing for Messiah, but he was not offering forgiveness. He was offering repentance from sin. And so Jesus comes to him, his own cousin in the flesh, and says, I need this. You go, why did he need it? Why would Jesus need to be baptized?
As a pattern for us?
Exactly. Not for himself.
No.
But he takes it as a pattern for us. He has a baptism. Why? We just read why. Because you didn't come into the inside and do any kind of meaningful sacrifice or ritual as a priest or a high priest unless you wash first, or else what would happen to you if you didn't? You die. So it was this very important preparation, this baptism that had to occur.
And all around the temple, they built mixes, which were the cleansing.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's the constant concept of the washing with water. So let's move on. We're in Exodus here. Why don't you turn over a few chapters to Exodus 37, and let's read about this, quote, candlestick or lampstand, better called the menorah. It is the menorah, the original menorah. The lampstand, starting in verse 17 of Exodus 37. Then he made the lampstand of pure gold. He made the lampstand of hammered work. Its base and its shaft, its cups, its bulbs, and its flowers were of one piece with it. I'd love to see this thing.
Yeah,
The way it's described, it had to be unbelievably beautiful and ornate. And it was made of a ton of gold, too. He says, and there was 6 branches going out of its sides. 3 branches of the lampstand from the one side, and 3 branches of the lampstand from the other side of it. 3 cups shaped like almond blossoms, a bulb and a flower in each branch, and 3 cups shaped like almond blossoms, a bulb and a flower in the other branch. So for the 6 branches going out of the lampstand, notice there's one central pole, and then there's 3 branches and 3 branches. So there's a total of 7. Okay? And in the lampstand, there were 4 cups shaped like almond blossoms, its bulbs and its flowers. And a bulb was under the first pair of branches coming out from it, and a bulb under the second pair of branches coming out, and a bulb under the third pair of branches, and 6 branches coming out from the lampstand. Their bulbs and their branches were of one piece with it. Can you imagine hammering this thing of gold in one piece this ornately? Somebody was good.
Well,
okay.
God, I think God gave them talent.
Yes,
yeah.
He sure did. Okay. And he made its 7 lamps with its snuffers and its trays of pure gold. He made it all in all its utensils from a talent of pure gold. So it was I think, an unbelievably ornate and beautiful thing. So it was inside the holy place. Okay, you had to go into the next compartment to find this lampstand.
Here's the name of the guy, the first one.
Who did this? Yeah, who the craftsman? Yes. Okay, and of course, as we said, it was made of solid gold, and it was filled with oil, which, quote, was never allowed to go out.
Mm-hmm.
So the only light inside the holy place was from this lampstand. And we know of its fulfillment in John 8:12, where Jesus says, I am the light of the world. This is the typological fulfillment. The only light inside this was the light of the lamp of the menorah. The only way you could see. Yeah, possibly, although it was a fair-sized thing. Now let's go to the next element. Go back now to the 25th chapter of Exodus. And we're going to read verses 23 through 30 about the table of showbread. Exodus 25, starting verse 23. And you shall make a table of acacia wood, 2 cubits long and 1 cubit wide and 1.5 cubits high. And you shall overlay it with pure gold and make a gold border around it. And you shall make for it a rim of handbreadth around it. And you shall make a gold border for the rim around it. And you shall make your 4 rings for it, and put rings on the 4 corners, which are on the 4 feet. Notice every one of these elements had rings on it, and ornate poles made for it. Why? To carry it, because this thing was mobile. It moved with them. Okay, everything had to be mobile and move. He says, then verse 27, the rings shall be close to the rim as holders for the poles to carry the table. And you shall make the poles of acacia wood and overlay them with gold, so that with them the table may be carried. And you shall make its dishes and its pans and its jars and its bowls with which to pour libations. You shall make them out of pure gold. And you shall set the bread of the presence on the table before me at all times. What that means, the table, the presence of the table, the bread of the presence of the table, were 12 total showbread of masa, of unleavened bread. They were in 2 piles, 6 on one side of it, 6 on the other side of it. Okay, why? The 12 tribes. It demonstrated, what did Jesus say about himself? I am the what? Bread of life. Okay? I am the bread of life. He also was the bread, as it were, the source, the key source of all the 12 tribes. And so each Sabbath, they would replace the bread with new bread. There would always be 12 loaves of bread on this table, with the other elements also with it. A look at, also, if you would, keep your finger here, if you would, and let's look at John 6:35. It's such a beautiful thing. So keep your hand in Exodus and go to John 6. Think of the fulfillment of this. John 6:35, he says, thus Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall not hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. And then he goes on and makes further promises. I want you to notice another fulfillment. I want you to turn, if you would, back to Matthew 14. I want to show you one example of how absolutely exact everything that they're told to do is, and how it always matches and has a perfect conclusion to it. Matthew 14, this is the feeding of the 5,000. They take these couple fish and few loaves of bread. Jesus prays and miraculously multiplies them. And they feed what is more than 5,000, because it says it's 5,000 men. But there are also women and children here too. Could be 15,000 or more people. Okay, can you imagine feeding 15 or more thousand people at one time by an absolute miracle? But let's look at how perfect the fulfillment is. Look at verse 20. And they all ate and were satisfied, and they picked up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. Let me assure you, that was not coincidental. It showed up on the table of showbread right there inside the tabernacle. This is its fulfillment in a very real way in the New Testament. Okay? Now, let's go from the table of showbread back to Exodus to the altar of incense. So let's go back to Exodus chapter 30 and read about the altar of incense. Starting there in verse 1 of Exodus 30. Moreover, you shall make an altar as a place for burning incense. You shall make it out of acacia wood. It shall be a cubit, and its width a cubit, and it shall be square, and its height shall be 2 cubits. Its horn shall be of one piece with it, and you shall overlay it with pure gold. Its top and its sides all around, and in its horns you shall make a gold molding all around for it. And you shall make 2 gold rings for it under its molding. You shall make 2 on the 2 sides of the walls, opposite the sides, and they shall be holders for poles for which to carry it. And you shall make the poles in acacia wood and overlay them with gold. And you shall put this altar in front of the veil that is near the Ark of Testimony. Okay? That is just before or close to going into the Holy of Holies, in front of the mercy seat that is over the Ark of the Testimony, where I will meet with you. And Aaron shall burn fragrant incense on it. He shall burn it every morning when he trims the lamps, and when Aaron trims the lamps at twilight, he shall burn incense. There shall be perpetual incense before the Lord throughout all generations. You shall not offer any strange incense at the altar. So therefore, no cannabis. And you shall not pour out libation on it. And Aaron shall make atonement on its horn once a year. He shall make an atonement on it with the blood of the sin offering of the atonement once a year throughout the generations. It is most holy to the Lord. Now you go, what is this 1.5 foot by 1.5 foot by 3 foot table with this sweet smelling incense on it? Well, I want you to keep your finger here. I want to show you its fulfillment. And I want you to go to 2 Corinthians chapter 2. So keep your hand in Exodus and go over to 2 Corinthians chapter 2. 2 Corinthians 2, and we're going to start looking at verse 14. 2 Corinthians 2, starting verse 14, okay? But thanks be to God, who always leads us in his triumph in Christ, and manifests to us the sweet aroma of the knowledge of him in every place. Notice that. I'll read it again. And manifest through us the sweet aroma of the knowledge of him in every place. For we are a fragrance of Christ to God through those who are being saved, and among those who are perishing. To the one an aroma from death to death. That would be the strange incense that you're not allowed to offer on the altar. Okay?
That's Aaron's son that killed him.
Exactly. And the other, an aroma from life to life. And who is adequate for these things? For we are not like, and he goes on and talks about, the sincerity of their ministry. This is the fulfillment. There's another passage in which the aroma is also likened to the prayers of the saints. Okay? So here we see literal incense, which is typologically talking about these things and their fulfillment here in the New Testament. So, back to Exodus. Let's go now to the Holy of Holies, the last 2 elements we're going to look at. And this is Exodus chapter 37. We're going to look at verses 1 through 9. This is the inner sanctum, the inner room, the most inner room. So, starting in verse 1 of Exodus 37. Now, Bezalel made the ark of acacia wood. Its length was 2.5 cubits, and its width 1.5 cubits, and its height 1.5 cubits. And he overlaid it with pure gold inside and out, and made a gold molding for it all around. And he cast 4 rings of gold for it on its 4 feet, even 2 rings on one side and 2 rings on the other side. And he made poles of acacia wood and overlaid them with gold. And he put the poles into the rings of the sides of the ark to carry it. And he made a mercy seat of pure gold, 2.5 cubits long and 1.5 cubits wide. And he made 2 cherubim of gold. And he made them of hammered work at the 2 ends of the mercy seat. 1 cherub on one end and 1 cherub on the other end. He made the cherubim of one piece with the mercy seat of the 2 ends. And the cherubim had their wings spread upward, covering the mercy seat, and their wings with their faces toward each other. The faces of the cherubim were toward the mercy seat. Now, this is the Ark of the Covenant. It rests inside this final inner sanctum of the tent, inside this holy place. It is separated, that is the Holy of Holies from the holy place, by a woven 4-inch veil of very intricately woven fabric. Imagine how heavy a 4-inch piece of woven fabric hung there is going to be. Okay? Only on the Day of Atonement was the high priest allowed to enter this inner sanctum of God's holy presence to offer the blood of the sacrifice which he brought in there onto this altar. The altar he offered it on was the top of the Ark of the Covenant. That's what he meant by the mercy seat. It was of pure hammered gold. On the 2 ends of it were these 2 cherubim, which represented the presence of God. They looked down onto this flat gold mercy seat. The high priest would come in on the Day of Atonement. He would sprinkle this blood all over the mercy seat. The idea being that when the angels looked down onto the top of the mercy seat, what did they see? Blood covering it. This, of course, is typological for the great sacrifice of Christ's blood, which, quote, completely covered all sins.
Now, did God erase those blood drops before the next year?
I'm not certain whether it was erased before the next year. Here, do you know?
There's no record of it, but if just pure logic says after 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, it's not going to be a real pleasant place.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think there's some kind of a cleansing happening.
Yeah, there may be. Keep your hand in Exodus. I want you to turn over to the book of Hebrews, because we want to see again another element of the fulfillment of this in Hebrews chapter 4. Hebrews chapter 4. And we're going to look verses 14 through 16. Hebrews 4, starting verse 14. Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses. That's why he had to be human. But one who has been tempted in all things which we are, remember his temptation, okay, yet without sin. Let us therefore draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and may find grace to help in the time of need. He is also our mercy seat, the source of all mercy. Now, I want you to see something else too. I want you to turn back, keep your finger in Exodus, but I want you to turn back to the book of Matthew, Gospel of Matthew. Because there's a very important event that occurred that should not be overlooked. It is found in Matthew 27. This is the record of the death of Jesus on the cross. Okay? Verse 50. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. Look what happens next. Verse 51. And behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And the earth shook and the rocks split. And the tombs were opened. And many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to many. That had to be a little freaky. Okay? But what did it prove? It proved that those that had died in waiting for Christ were alive. Some of them came out. They're here. Okay?
And they saw him.
Yes. So, notice though, the veil is broken in half.
From bottom to top.
Absolutely. It would take an unbelievable force. Yeah, it would take an unbelievable force to break that 4-inch veil in half. But it had to be broken because God had to show in the pattern of the tabernacle, the Jews knew, the veil is done. There's no longer any veil. There's constant access now to the mercy seat. That was the point he was demonstrating. And they missed it. So lastly, we'll talk a little bit about this Ark of the Covenant. We read about it. It's composed of two different pieces. The lower box in this upper lid called the mercy seat. It was approximately 4 feet by 2 feet by 2 feet box, covered in gold. The lid was solid gold, and the two corners, as we said, were these two statues of the cherubim. Inside the ark were three things. First of all were the tablets of the Ten Commandments, which would have actually been the second tablets of the Ten Commandments. Because what happened to the first tablets? Moses broke them. Because he saw the people sinning in idolatry, and he threw them down. And interestingly enough, isn't it interesting? God did not chastise him for doing that. That was righteous anger. So inside was the Ten Commandments, the second copy. And then there was the golden jar of manna, which showed God's provision for them in the manna all during the wilderness, and was Aaron's rod, which had budded as a miracle. Now, I want to point out also that in the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament, we have the word there in Romans 3:25. We call it in English propitiation. In the Septuagint, the top of the mercy seat is called the propitiation. Okay? It's Christ. The propitiation, the mercy seat. So, well, we'll stop here about the tabernacle. There are so many elements that, frankly, one could go into, but we'll stop here and at least that gives you some idea of what the fulfillment is, the themes of these things that continues. Let's talk for a moment now in your outline on F about the Mosaic Covenant. God accumulates all these laws and instructions that he gives to Moses and makes a covenant. This is recorded in Exodus 34, 10 through 28. You don't have to look there if you don't want to, but that's the Old Testament reference to it. This covenant, of course, is a conditional covenant. It contains both blessings and cursings, and it's dependent on the performance of the people. Notice God gave the Noahic covenant, which was not conditional. He gave the Abrahamic covenant, which is not conditional. And then he gives the Mosaic covenant, but it is conditional. It's a performance covenant. Of course, we talked about the law and how it's a performance covenant purposely to show you can't live it. That's its purpose ultimately. Even before Moses leaves the top of Mount Sinai, the people start to break the law. And of course, Moses ends up becoming the mediator, pleading for the nation that God will not destroy them, literally, despite their sins. He is, typologically, in this act, the Messiah figure, the Christ figure, the perfect mediator. You can keep your finger again in Exodus, to turn back to Hebrews 3. I want you to see the fulfillment of this event in the New Testament. Hebrews 3, verses 5 and 6. I'll read what is written here. 3 verses 5 and 6. Now Moses was faithful in all his house as a servant, for a testimony of those things which will be spoken later. But Christ was faithful as a son over his house, whose house we are, if we hold fast our confidence and the boast of our hope firm until the end. So Moses was faithful as a mediator for the Jewish people, but he was only a temporary intermediary, waiting for the total fulfillment of it, which of course came in Christ. Moses was an unbelievable person, though, and I want to show that to you here in a second. He was unique in all of history. In outline G, we talk about the next phase here, which was Israel's time to enter the land. They were about 10 months there at Sinai. God commands the people to move eventually after 10 months, after all the laws and the organization, to this area in the wilderness called Kadesh Barnea. There he sends out 12 men to spy out the land. 2 of them are Joshua and Caleb. They go through the land for a number of weeks. They see huge produce. They see mammoth cities that have huge walls. They see Gebarim tribes of people who are 10 to 13 feet tall. And 10 of the spies come back and in their report convince the Jewish nation that it cannot be conquered. This, of course, is the illustration of unbelief despite the clear promises of God. It goes over and over again all through the Old and into the New Testament. 2 of them state that it can be taken because God said it could be taken, Joshua and Caleb. And therefore, all but them die in the next intervening 40 years. God has them marching all over this wilderness area in this place that gets 1 inch of rain a year approximately, if that, until that generation dies. At the end of the 40 years, when the last one has died, Moses says his farewell and, quote, dies on Mount Nebo, having never entered the promised land, and God buries Moses himself. Moses, of course, is a unique person in all history. Turn from Exodus over, if you would, if you're in Exodus, to Numbers. I don't know about you, but when I read about Moses, I want to meet him.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'd like to meet him.
Numbers chapter 12. Well, we will meet him. It will be a glorious day. Numbers chapter 12. There's a couple unique things I want to mention here about him. And I want you to see verses 6 through 8 of 12. Numbers 12. Starting verse 6. He said, "Hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, shall make myself known to him in a vision. I shall speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my household. With him I speak mouth to mouth." Notice that. With him I speak mouth to mouth, even openly and not in dark sayings. And he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant, against Moses? This is said of no one else in the Bible. He's completely unique in that sense. Go from Numbers to the next book, to Deuteronomy. And go to the last chapter of it, chapter 34. And we're going to look at verses 10 through 12. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. For all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all his servants and all his land, and for all the mighty power and for all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. No prophet was ever like him. Of all the prophets, none ultimately was like him. He had that unique quality. And isn't it interesting that he has this very, very odd death, quote unquote. Okay? Matter of fact, you can, if you, in the same chapter, let me read verses 4 and 5 and 6. Then the Lord said to him, this is the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, since I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab. He's on top of Mount Nebo, looking into Israel, okay? He died there in the land of Moab according to the word of the Lord, and he, that is God, buried him in the valley of the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no man knows his burial place to this day. And Moses was 120 years old when he died, and he was not dim, nor his vigor abated. So it was simply his time. Now, it's interesting because Moses, quote, dies at this time. God buries him in some unique way. But what do we see in the New Testament? Matthew chapter 17. Jesus goes to this Mount Hermon, which ironically and interestingly, but for a purpose, was apparently where all these fallen angels came and entered into the world and created havoc. And Jesus goes to that very place in Mount Hermon, and there he's transfigured into his real form, so bright of light that no one could almost look at him. And who's with him? Moses and Elijah. Okay? And here they talk with each other. And I think I know what their conversation was. Maybe I'm wrong. Jerry, what do you think their conversation was?
Scripture says what the conversation
Go ahead.
about Jesus' death, his demise.
Okay. I'll bet you they had another conversation. Maybe I'm wrong.
I'm sure they had several.
But I'll bet you they had another one too. I'll bet you in their farewell when they left the mountaintop, I'll bet you they said, see you again.
See you soon.
See you soon. Why?
Because Jesus was going to die.
And what else? What about them?
Maybe they were resurrected there when Jesus was resurrected.
What were they going to do? I'll bet you Moses looked at Elijah and said, buddy, I'll see you again. Because where do we see them again?
After Jesus comes again.
We see them as the two lampstands and the two, what is called the two lampstands and the two olive trees, okay, that are prophesied in the Old Testament. They are the two witnesses in the book of Revelation. And what do? If you read it, it's really kind of hilarious. They make the Antichrist miserable for 3.5 years. They taunt him. They make life horrible for him for 3.5 years. They make life horrible for everyone that doesn't love the Lord for 3.5 years. They are an example of what he does not have the power to overcome. They bring down fire. They do all kinds of things that taunt him horribly until at 3.5 years, God says, okay, it's time, you're done. And they die. And what happens? What does it say in the book of Revelation when they die?
Party.
Right. All the people of the earth who are allied to the Antichrist say, finally, they're dead. It's over with.
No.
Okay?
It's not.
No, it's not. Okay? But again, they have a unique history. They have a very unique history.
Don't you imagine after that 3.5 days laying in the streets, when they come alive,
Exactly.
Harold Wright, What just happened here?
What just happened? Exactly. This apparently is not over.
Which is interesting because Elijah was raptured. He was taken.
Exactly.
And it would almost lead you to think that Moses was too.
There's something very odd about his, quote, death.
Yeah.
We're not told exactly what it is, but I would agree with you, Ann. I think that he was also taken. I think he didn't see death in the conventional sense. Now, let me read one more thing about him that gives credence to the fact that he had a very unusual death and burial. It's in Jude, and I'm going to read verse 9. But Michael, the archangel, when he disputed with the devil and argued about the body of Moses, did not dare pronounce against Satan a railing judgment, but said, "The Lord rebuke you." Think about that for a moment. Think about that, how odd it is and how interesting it is. Who was looking for the body of Moses?
The devil.
Devil. He couldn't find it. Okay? And Michael, this powerful angel, was sent to apparently block him from finding him. Why would Satan want the body of Moses?
Yeah, why?
Well, think about what we just said. Why would he want the body?
Well, did he know that Moses was going to be involved with the end time then?
I personally think he must have known that. Because why would he have wanted the body? He wants to prevent him from coming back, I think. What do you think, Gary?
I agree.
Yeah. So it's his failed strategy to try to come up with a body to prevent Moses from coming back, because he knows this is not going to go well for his strategy when Moses comes back to the earth again. Okay?
Well, then maybe Christ didn't actually bury Moses on the earth.
Well,
I mean, he may have.
I think he might have. Well,
and then it was misunderstood.
Well, it's hard to say what it meant when it said God buried him. I mean, there are enough things that make you wonder what kind of burial was this. Certainly, we know that whatever he did, it was mysterious, and it was done in a way that nobody could figure out wwhere he was.
God buried him, you might think, like God took care of him.
Maybe.
In the general way.
Because
what
makes me think of that, because Satan has the power on earth that he would have probably been able to find Moses even though Moses was buried. But if he wasn't here on earth and was moved from the powers of Satan, then he would have had to be in the heavenly someplace.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we don't know.
Yeah.
I guess. That's pure conjecture.
Yeah. Well, let me summarize here, and then we can stop for this evening. We just covered elements between Genesis 38 and Deuteronomy 34 in this panel that well, we didn't put the panel up tonight, I guess, but and the elements of it. There are a bunch of themes that we see in this, and I'm going to mention them to you, 29 of them, but I'll bet you there's a lot more. But I'll pick out 29. The theme of the interpretation of prophetic dreams for an empire. It starts here in Joseph, but there's a lot of other people it happens to, particularly Daniel, so it continues. The theme of forgiveness leading to blessing is seen very clearly here. The theme of preparation. Notice that Noah is to prepare. Joseph is to prepare. The theme of preparation. We should pay attention to that. The theme of famine. It doesn't stop here. We see evidence of famine in 2 Kings 8. And of course, finally in its ultimate fulfillment in Revelation 6, verses 5 through 6, which speaks about famine. Of course, the theme of the nation of Israel really begins here. The theme of the blessing that leads to cursing. Notice as they come out of Egypt, they're thrilled that they receive so many wonderful trinkets. And quote, the blessing But what happens to many of those trinkets?
The golden
They make a golden calf of idolatry and fall into sin. So I mentioned here 1 Timothy 6:6-11. Okay? This is, of course, where Paul tells us, that we're to be careful about the accumulation of wealth, that the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil, and through it many people are pierced through with a pang. What you think you have or you possess may end up having you. And of course this theme starts here. The theme of slavery and bondage. It begins here, but the children of Israel perpetually go through it. They go through it in Babylon. They go through it with Assyria. They go through it in many different cases, okay, all the way through into almost, from the time of Christ coming to the earth, where really, in essence, the slaves, in a great sense, of the Romans at that point. We see Moses as a prototype, as we were just talking about, a unique life and a unique death. We see the theme of God using plagues. It starts here, but it doesn't end here. Where do we see a very clear evidence of God using plagues? Right. 21 different ones that he uses. So it continues through. We see the theme of an exodus, okay, which again occurs in terms of our own spiritual exodus also in our own lives. We see the beginning of the theme of idolatry with the golden calf. We see the theme of Mount Sinai as we looked at Galatians 4 and the Hagar and Sarah and the whole principles of Sinai. We see, of course, the theme of the death of the firstborn here, which foreshadows the death of God's own firstborn in Jesus himself. We see the important theme of the Passover, which begins here, which is called an eternal ordinance. An eternal ordinance. Okay? We see it over and over again, and something that we need to pay attention to ourselves. By the way, you remind me, we need to celebrate it also on some level here in a few weeks when we meet together. We see the theme of the slain lamb and its blood led on an altar. We see the theme of the blood over the doorposts, the posts of the home, which of course symbolically and typologically are for our own lives. We are covered by that blood in our own life, our own home. We see also the theme of being wanderers and sojourners. It begins here, but it continues for Israel. And what are we called in 1 Peter? We're called aliens, strangers, and wanderers in a foreign land. As it says in the old refrain of the home, this world is not your home, you're just a passing through. Okay? Pilgrims. We see the theme of spiritual Egypt, which is really occultic and satanic. We see it going through Babylon. We see it in its ultimate form where? In its conclusion in Mystery Babylon, in the book of Revelation. We see the theme of the parting of the Red Sea and the miracle of that parting and how God parts things in our own life spiritually. We see this interesting theme at the time of the parting of the sea, when the backs of the Jews are to the wall on one side of the sea and to Pharaoh's arm on the other. We see the theme where Moses says to them, quote, stand, watch, and stand firm. These are the words he uses to Israel. What do we see in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 and 11? About our spiritual warfare. He says, stand firm. We see the cloud by day and the light by night. And Jesus is the light of the world who leads us in his way. We see the theme of the cloud of Jesus. Right here it was, we said in Matthew 17, in the Mount of Transfiguration. What happens? Where do they come from? From a cloud. Okay? What happens when Jesus ascends from this earth? In a cloud it comes down. What happens when he comes to take his church? In a cloud. And when he returns back on Mount Sinai, Mount of Olives, from a cloud. So the theme of the cloud. We see the theme of the Ten Commandments and the law, which stretches all the way through the New Testament. We see the theme of the Tabernacle, which hopefully you learned some about tonight as we saw it. We see this theme of the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur. Again, another eternal covenant, eternal code, an eternal ordinance. We see the theme of the high priest, which was fulfilled in Jesus' own death and resurrection. We see the theme of the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy of Holies and the Mercy Seat, which we talk about here in the book of Hebrews and their fulfillment. We see the theme of the Mosaic Covenant and the one mediator of Moses through it. We see the theme of the wanderings of God's people. And of course, we're taught in the book, the New Testament, many places, our own spiritual wanderings. And we see the theme of the golden calf and the danger of idolatry. Now, I'm certain there's plenty more if you look more carefully. But there's certainly at least 29 of them right here in these sections of the Old Testament that see their fulfillment in the New Testament. So, we'll move on.
You know, the wanderings in the wilderness for 40 years, it wasn't really a big place. They could have found their way out, but they were blinded.
They were.
For 40 years.
Because they were under a curse. The curse of their own choosing. Okay? Of their own choosing. The consequence of their own decisions. They wouldn't believe that they could conquer the land at that point. So.
And ultimately, they weren't ready.
It's true. It's true. It's true.
Have you ever wondered who did all the funerals? Think about it.
It's a lot of funerals.
I mean, in 40 years, at least 1 million people died. Divide the number of days into 1 million. I mean, it's kind of like our World War II vets today. We're fast reaching that point. There's very few World War II vets still alive. But, there had to be funerals day after day after day after day of people passing away.
They were done in between the sacrifices.
Yeah.
Because they were sacrificing all the time.
Yes. 40 different years of it. It's interesting, this theme of the Exodus. Again, we could go on and on. I'm just going to read this to you. Here's another image of it, Psalm 91. And you will not be afraid of the terror by night, or of the arrow that flies by day, of the pestilence that stalks in the darkness, or of the destruction that lays waste at noon. 1,000 may fall at your right at one side, and 10,000 at your right at your other side, but it shall not approach you. You will only look on with your eyes and see the recompense of the wicked. I think that's a very distinct image of the Exodus and of the plagues, but it's prophetic. It's of the future. It's a future event. So, anyway, we move on from Deuteronomy, we move on to Joshua, and we'll start to go through the themes of Joshua and some of the themes of the prophets next week. We'll start to take the next panel. So, questions, comments, clear as mud.